the meaning of Ibra. Literally, the word Ibra connotes to exonerate and dissociate from something. In the context of debt obligation, Ibra means to absolve a debtor from a debt or obligation that is established in his liability. Technically, Ibra is an act of absolving one's financial right established in another person's liability, which leads to discharging the other from the liability to fulfill the obligation. It is an unilateral waiver of right by a party to the contract, which is granted out of his ihsan at his sole discretion. This signifies that if the claims and right are not the liability of the latter, such as right of sufa, then the relinquishment will not be considered Ibra, but merely an obsolescence of rights. On this basis, every act of Ibra is considered isqat, and not every obsolescence is deemed Ibra. Sharia scholars argue that Ibra assumes a distinctive further of having the element of isqat and tamlik, because in the context of debt obligation, Ibra means absolution of the one's financial right and assigning ownership to the debtor.
I will continue with the evidence of Ibra. Ibra is recommended or called as mandub, which has a meaningful purpose or which should be encouraged. So the creditor has right to help the debtor who is having trouble in repaying the debt. Even if the debtor is not having trouble in repaying the debt, Ibra is still recommended as it can develop the relationship of trust and friendship between the creditor and the debtor. So the evidence of Ibra is from the Al-Quran and Hadith. So from the Al-Quran, it says, and if the debtor is in difficulty, grant him time till it's easy for him to repay. But if yet remain it's by way of charity. That is the best for you if yet only know. So another evidence of Ibra can be get from the question whether Ibra can be given in case of early settlement of debt has been discussed by the Sharia scholar under the concept of reduce and expedite. So this concept have its root in the hadith of the Prophet, in which the Prophet said to the Jew of Bani Nadir when instructing him to leave Medina. So the hadith is reduce the debts and expedite its settlement. So the reduce and expedite refer to the situation where the creditor asks the debtor to expedite the payment of the debt, and in return, the creditor will reduce the debt. Or the debtor may ask the creditor to reduce his debt, and in return, he will expedite the settlement of the debt. So the Sharia scholar are divided in their view as the permissible of the reduce and expedite optionized. Next is the pillar and condition of Ibra. There are 5 pillars of Ibra. The first is the creditor, the second is debtor, the third is debt, fourth is Ibra, and the fifth is the contract. Next is the condition of creditor, the seller, and the debtor, the buyer. So the seller has responsible for supplying the product that ordered by the buyer, and the buyer obligate to pay the product that he purchased or according to agreed term of the agreement, and both parties must be adult, rational, intelligent, and can be held accountable. So for the condition of debt, which is the deferred selling price, is as the selling price, the debt must be absolute amount and non-currency. Next is the condition of Ibra, which is the partial refund of money paid. So there are 2 ways of dealing with Ibra. The first one, it must not be stated in sales agreement in an absolute amount of percentage in asset sales agreement. Or the second is it may be stated in the sales agreement in an absolute amount and non-currency. When this done, there will be 2 prices in the contract, and the seller, the creditor, is entitled to lesser of the price only. It is the invalid for the seller to withdraw the Ibra. The condition of the contract, that is ijab and kabul, is no riba trading involved. Contract must be valid. The contract is incorporated in the asset sales management, and it must be absolute and defining, and both parties must understand the language. Next is the current Sharia practice in banking finance. Ibra is given to the customers who repay the debt early than the period agreed when the contract is signed. It is a reward to good customer whose credit rating was good based on the customer's financing data. In the security document signed between the customer and the bank did not contain any provision on Ibra. Only the letter of offer contains a statement of policy stating that Ibra may be granted by the bank at its own discretion. So Ibra has led many uncertainty in terms of final amount due and payable by the customer. So it became clear when Syariah Advisor Council (SAC) and Bank Negara Malaysia (BNM) has remedied the resolution for it and made it compulsory for the Islamic bank to include Ibra in a legal documentation of the financing and to follow BNM's formula in the calculation of Ibra. And there are three situations that bank will give Ibra to the customer. The first one is to the customer who made the preliminary settlement, and the second one is the financial restructure when the customer want to restructure the financing, and the third one is default in making payment when the customer cannot pay the debt.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Sembilan Rasha binti Fauzi, and today I'm going to talk about the flows of contract practice on Ibra. The general notion that prevails today is that Islamic banks always claim the full purchase price whenever there is default, and that Ibra is only given completely at the discretion of the bank in case of voluntary early settlement by the customer. The practice of giving rebate or discounts by Islamic banks to their customers started since early days of Islamic banking. The rebate was given as a reward to good customers whose credit rating was good based on customers' financing data. So, if the record kept by the bank shows that the customer paid his monthly installments promptly and regularly, the bank will discount the amount that customer needs to pay. This rebate granted by the banks to good customers was initially called mukasah, although the original meaning of the term is set-off and not rebate. Soon after, the mistake was spotted by the Islamic banks, and mukasah was replaced with the correct term Ibra. Therefore, it can be said that granting of Ibra by Islamic banks was done since the very beginning of the Islamic banking industry, much before any regulatory guidelines were issued. One of the motivating factors for practice of Ibra by Islamic banks was the competition with the conventional counterparts. The Islamic banks needed to have a similar competitive mechanism whereby they could waive the so-called unearned profit. Otherwise, they risk losing a huge pool of customers to conventional banks. The Islamic banks face many legal and Sharia challenges. Should Ibra be granted for both types of early settlement, for example, voluntary settlement by customer and forced settlement by the bank, which could happen due to many reasons such as death of customer, bankruptcy, default in monthly payment? Should granting of Ibra remain to be at the discretion of the bank or not? These were some of the important questions which had to be resolved in a way which is acceptable to all stakeholders and yet remain in compliance with laws and Sharia requirements.
Although sale-based financial necessitate the existence of the asset, there are cases of financial facility being terminated due to non-delivery or non-possession of asset. This case may originate from abandoned projects, for example, housing under construction, mandatory purchase by government, fraud by vendor or manufacturer, act of God, and seizure of asset by custom. IFI are required to apply due consideration in handling cases of non-possession of asset by the customer. In some situations, IFI may suffer losses due to non-payment of financing, while the customer may end up without any asset. In the case of non-possession of asset by the customer and where there is a portion of the principal amount yet to be disputed, such as in the case of abandoned project, IFI are not allowed to claim the undisbursed principal amount. Instead, upon settlement by customer, the IFI should grant Ibra on the undisbursed principal amount. Principally, IFI may only recover the disbursed cost of purchase and waive the profit portion in the case of non-possession of asset by the customer. In some circumstances, IFI may have already occurred some portion of profit for a certain period during the term of the financing contract. In this situation, IFI are allowed to claim the accrued profit portion of financing up to date of the first sign of inability to deliver the asset. For example, the date of the last amount disbursed to the contractor, or when the project is categorized as late, or the pronouncement of court order to stop construction. IFI are expected to perform their due diligence as a counterparty of the sale contract or transaction involving assets that are under construction or manufacturing. IFI are expected to establish a monitoring mechanism to identify signs of non-delivery of assets, such as ensuring that there is a frequent communication with the customer and contractor.
To conclude, the main dissatisfaction with Islamic banking since its introduction was over the full purchase price that customers who would like to make an early settlement and defaulting customers would have to pay. Of course, it takes about 3 decades for the Sharia to develop to overcome this problem. But 3 decades in the history of Sharia is a short period. It shows that Sharia is developing in order to be relevant, and ironically, in this case, it is an Islamic conventional system that pushes it to develop. This is the beauty of competition and perhaps the wisdom of having 2 parallel systems running side by side.